This past Thursday was a very specific holiday that I'd be willing to bet few, if any of you, observed. It was the feast day of St. Wilgefortis. And so I want to start out by telling you a story that will, for the record, be very relevant to the point I'm trying to make, even though it's going to start out sounding more than usually tangential, even for me. That's what you laugh at. I'm hilarious. So you see, once upon a time, there was a beautiful princess who wanted to dedicate her life to God. But her dad, the king, was not a Christian himself, and he was not on board with this plan, to put it mildly, because obviously the point of having a daughter, if you're a king, is to be able to marry her off for some kind of peace treaty or land deal or power grab. And it was going to be pretty hard to do that if she was going to insist on either marrying a fellow Christian or becoming a nun. So he said to the princess, either you will marry the pagan lord I arranged for you to marry, or you will be locked in my dungeon until you agree to marry the pagan lord I arranged for you to marry. The princess said, if those are my options, I guess I'm moving to the dungeon. This was not the direction that the king had anticipated the conversation would go. The king was upset, and the man who was supposed to become his son-in-law was upset. And the princess in the dungeon was getting nervous that she would somehow be forced into this marriage no matter what she did. So she prayed to God for a miracle. Now, God gave us free will. And there are only so many miracles that God can offer us without taking away our free will and the consequences of it. God wasn't going to wave a magic wand and poof, there goes the patriarchy. And God wasn't going to force the men in the story to suddenly have a change of heart. It might be easier for us in some ways if that was the sort of miracle that God was willing to offer us. But God gave us free will, and that means that the princess could decide she did not want an arranged marriage, but that also means that her father could decide to force the issue. So instead, God offered a very different kind of miracle. The princess awoke the next morning, rocking a full beard. The king was horrified and also very confused. The would-be fiancé was repulsed and also very confused. The wedding was called off. Her father, having no idea what else to do, had his daughter crucified. The princess became an actual Christian saint. Her name is Wilgefortis, and technically the Catholic Church took away her official saint status a few generations ago just because she didn't technically, historically speaking, actually exist. But she's still an icon for many people and the patron saint of women who aren't conventionally beautiful, and of trans people, and of women trying to get out of difficult situations, and of women whose circumstances punish them for choosing their faith. The generally accepted theory is that some Christians from Western traditions went on pilgrimages to churches in Eastern traditions that had different art styles. At home, they were used to images of Christ being a bearded figure on a cross who wore a loincloth, looking very male and human and sad. But suddenly they were seeing images of a bearded figure on a cross who was dressed in royal robes and a crown, a lanky figure, almost an androgynous one. The art depicted Jesus, but the pilgrims weren't used to seeing Jesus look like that. So they read the images as a woman in a dress and a crown on a cross, and built up stories around that interpretation. Sometimes language and culture barriers can get really interesting. Now, personally, I love the story of Wilgefortis, and I actually own a little icon of my patron saint. And I think it's a valuable, if bizarre, chapter in the history of Christian storytelling. But this story only exists because people made images of Jesus. Paintings, sculptures, engravings, graven images, if you will. And technically, there is something in the Ten Commandments about not making graven images or not worshiping idols, depending on which translation you're reading, because sometimes images can become idols and take on a life of their own. Art can be a part of the way we tell the story of our faith and a part of the way we worship God. But art can also overshadow its subject until we focus on the piece itself and the skills of the artist, with the story of faith becoming an afterthought. To be very clear, I am not standing here about to condemn the long tradition of Christian art, but there can sometimes be a danger in turning God into something we could hold in our hands, turning the good news into a catchy slogan that might fit on a bumper sticker, creating an image that could so easily be misunderstood or reinterpreted, presenting one and only one facet of the nature of the divine. But it's hard to tell the story of the crucifixion within the framework of a nativity play. It's hard to include healings or teachings or loaves and fishes or parables into an image of Jesus walking on water. It's nigh on impossible to portray Jesus as being simultaneously human and divine. Anytime we try to make an image of Jesus, we are leaving out part of the story. Again, I'm not up here condemning the long tradition of Christian art, but there can sometimes be a danger in reducing God down to something we could hold in our hands, because God is so much more than any one image. If we want to get closer to seeing God, we need to seek out different images and angles and experiences and traditions. If we only see God in one kind of image, then that kind of image becomes the way we see God, and that kind of image becomes an idol. In the Middle Ages, pilgrims from Western churches traveled to Eastern churches and didn't always recognize Jesus because they were so used to seeing Jesus in a different way. It is true that Jesus lived and died alongside us and suffered human pain. That's the Jesus that these pilgrims were used to. But it is also true that Jesus was a divine king, even if the pilgrims didn't recognize him drawn that way. I'm not exactly complaining that the pilgrims went home spreading the story of St. Wilgefortis, but the more we walk around to see different angles of Jesus, the more of Jesus we'll be able to see. If we only see God in one kind of image, then that kind of image becomes the way we see God, and that kind of image becomes an idol. So is art idolatry? The short answer, in my opinion, is no. That's not very helpful, but no, not usually. I think it comes down to motivation. Maybe you buy or make or commission a fancy painting of Jesus for your home in order to impress people or make sure they know that you are a good Christian. But maybe you buy or make or commission a fancy painting of Jesus for your home in order to have a daily reminder that he is part of your household. Throughout Christian history, in the process of building or furnishing any space for Christian worship, there have been two extremes. On the one hand, you can keep a space as simple as possible, with minimal distractions, without pomp or circumstance or pageantry, making sure that the emphasis is on God and not any symbol or tradition or anything that could evoke a feeling of undue pride or self-congratulation. Keeping your expenses low so that you can spend the bulk of your resources on supporting strong and thoughtful church leadership, leading the work of God in your communities. Do you prioritize worship, or do you prioritize service and generosity and connection? But on the other hand, you can invite a community to offer their best, to make sacrifices so that they feel invested, to create grand churches with soaring ceilings and spires, filled with the music of angels and with art that inspires awe, and with rainbows that shine in through stained glass windows. to create spaces for worship that take your breath away, make you feel small next to the incredible beauty and power of God? Do you prioritize service, or do you prioritize worship and evangelism and community? Most churches aim for something in between, but there is no right answer, and the debate will never be settled. There is much to be said for humility, for keeping your focus on scripture and learning and service. There is also much to be said for the way that Christian art has spoken so strongly to so many people over the centuries and offered different outlets for people to be involved in their communities. But sparse worship spaces can feel utilitarian and uninspiring, and don't always do a good job of telling a visitor about the stories and values of that church. And it can leave a sour taste in the mouth when gilded cathedrals require millions of dollars of upkeep while so many people in the world are struggling financially. There is no right answer. But at what point does an image or an object or a symbol stop being a reminder or an inspiration and become an idol that we give more time and energy than we give God? Yet again, at the risk of repeating myself, I am absolutely not standing here condemning the long tradition of Christian art and music and architecture, but there can sometimes be a danger in reducing God down to something we could hold in our hands. Does art help us to focus our faith, or does it take on a life of its own? Is a piece of music an expression of worship, or is it a performance? When does a space stop being a place of worship and become a museum? How could a cross go from being a reminder to being just a piece of jewelry? At what point does an object stop being an inspiration and start being an idol? Our second scripture reading this morning comes to us from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 6, verses 19 through 24. Hear now the word of the Lord. Jesus said, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters, for they will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and wealth. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. You cannot serve both God and wealth. It would certainly be easy to read these words of Jesus as condemning the acquisition of treasure and riches entirely. You may have heard a sermon on this passage that made you feel really freaking bad about owning nice things that go beyond a reasonable definition of needs as opposed to wants. To be fair, there are people in this world who need to hear that message. But I think that the heart of the point Jesus is making is that we should consider the purpose of the treasures that we have. Are we squirreling them away so that moths and rust could consume it all? Or do we want money so that we could use it for a good purpose, whether that's in the form of some kind of charity or making someone's life a little bit easier, or just creating joy in our communities? Do we see resources as a competition or as a means to an end? Would we leave our treasures to rust before we would let them be used by someone else? Jesus says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Do we keep our hearts locked up in the safe where we keep our treasures? Or do we take our treasures out to where our hearts are? What is our motivation? Who is our priority? Could someone else tell from the way we live our lives and the way we use our resources that we honor God and follow Jesus? Or would someone get the impression from the way we live our lives and the way we use our resources that we are hoarding anything that we can get our hands on, more than we ourselves could ever use, putting our excess towards our own comfort or vanity or public image instead of using it to love our neighbors? Are resources a goal in and of themselves, or are they a tool for making or strengthening something else? Do our treasures help us worship God and serve the world, or do they become what we worship? Are they tools, or are they idols? So here we might return to the second of the 10 commandments, the commandment not to make and worship idols or graven images in some translations. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. It could be easy to brush past this commandment. After all, we do not live in a society in which our faith is the strange and unusual minority. We are not faced every day with literal idols that our neighbors literally worship. We don't have golden calves here in our church. There don't appear to be any idols here. But an idol doesn't exist in a vacuum. An idol is created when we look at something that was meant to help us focus our worship, but we turn around and place so much value on the thing itself that it becomes, metaphorically speaking, the focus of our worship. Yet again, I am not standing here condemning the rich and meaningful history of Christian art. It is really hard to dig into the second commandment without criticizing some form of religious art in some way, whether or not that was the intent. It is absolutely not mine. But there have been times when we have valued objects more than people, when we have come close to worshiping the things that were supposed to help us worship God, when we have taken all the complexities of the divine and pulled out only one kind of image, ignoring the rest. Jesus says, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. You cannot serve both God and wealth." What is it that you treasure, and why? That why is the question that draws the line between treasure and idolatry. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. This is the word of the Lord.